next slide. So it's going to do that. The slide number 2, which is welcome and introductions, purpose of the day, confidentiality, and be flexible. I think that some people wonder about this, and some people say, well, because sometimes in the language that's going on right now in the community, some people are kind of anti-immigrant and are wondering what's going on. Is this somehow helping illegal people become citizens? And it's absolutely not. This is people, all the people you're going to be dealing with at this program are permanent residents. The government has approved them to have permanent resident status in the United States. They are what people generally call green card holders. And these are people who may have held that status for a few years, several years. They might have held it for 20-some years, but for whatever reason, not gotten around to the process of actually doing the next, not required, but potentially logical step, which is to become a US citizen or to seek that process. And so this is a day that takes them through a very daunting part of the process. And if you've looked at the N400 form, the form that we're actually going to be helping people complete, you're going to realize it's not the easiest thing to fill out. I mean, it generally takes a lawyer going through the process. It takes me about 2 hours minimum when I'm really going through it with a client. And that's when I've had a lot of opportunity to prepare. So in a very short period of time, we're going to go through a lot of difficult, complicated information. Some people ask when they hear about this, they think, well, should I be going to the government for this? We're not government agents. None of us are government agents, at least for the purpose of this program. We're out there as volunteers helping people out in this process. And I'm going to encourage you to be flexible. When we do these programs, a lot of you, more than half in the room, have never done this before. They will be looking to those of us who have done it before. Help me out. What do I do? Where do I send someone next? For many of us, we're going to a room where this is going to be occurring where none of us have been before. We have not done it in this room before. And so we're going to be trying to figure out, where do people move? Who's the next person to talk to? Things like that. So just be flexible and ask a lot of questions. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. I'm going to go to the next slide now, and that is slide number 3, the 6 basic stations areas at site. This is also new for people because we're really going to be moving people, got more and more specific in it. All right, just imagine, if you will, since I have not been to the room where we're going to be doing our program in Des Moines, frequently at the beginning of the session, there are people already lined outside the door. When you get there at 8 o'clock, doors don't open until 10. But sometimes there are people already waiting there. It's that important in their lives. They want to be sure that they're there. The first thing they do is go to an intake or greeting station where someone makes sure that they're there at the right program, that they have the kind of documents they need, things like that. Then they move on to the forms preparation station. This is where paralegals and law students and lawyers who are not immigration lawyers will be there to go through the basic forms process with them. Now, today's session is a combination of all volunteers and paralegals. How many of you are paralegals who are planning to do paralegal work here? One person in the room. All right, she's the one who has to stay all the way to the end of this program. About partway through, I'll say we're getting into the more detailed stuff. If you're not a paralegal, you don't need to stay here. I've never actually had other people leave, though. They're still interested enough to figure out what's, want to know what's going on. After the paralegals put together the basic N400 form, then the person moves to the next station, which is the attorney station. And this is where the attorneys or the BIA, Board of Immigration Appeals, where accredited representatives can work with them to actually make sure the form's done correctly. Because this is such a serious form, we really need to be sure that the proper people are involved in that process at that stage. I've been working with my paralegals at my office for a minimum of 10 years. We've all been working together for that long. But still, it's important that the lawyer needs to see this because there's information there that the attorneys may be more familiar with. Fourth station is quality review. Why? Well, normally at the attorney time, that would be the last person to see it in the law office. But you have to remember, we're all coming together for one time only. May never see each other again. We may never work with each other again. And we may never have worked with each other already. So this is a time for, as this program, for a kind of like, did we do it right? Did everybody get all parts of their process done correctly? Because we're trying to do it so quickly and efficiently. So it's that chance for the quality review to occur, make sure everything's done, signed, all the boxes are checked. Then it goes to the next stage, which is the copy center. And believe it or not, people can get their copying messed up. These are double-sided forms frequently. Sometimes people miss that second side. What we want to do is make sure that when people walk out of there, not only do they have the documents that they're going to file, but they have an actual full photocopy of everything being filed. So that if there are any questions later on, we can say this is what got sent or what was prepared to be sent to the government. And the fourth one is the exit station. Yes, it's really an exit station. I'm not just saying they go out the door, but we want them to return certain documents and forms to show that we've gone through the process correctly. It's part of our quality review, part of our ability to make sure we do the program well and get it better for the next time. All right, so we're going to go on to the next slide, slide number 4, which is what to expect on Citizenship Day. First of all, we do want all of our volunteers to arrive at 8 o'clock. Appreciate you coming here at noon hour, a couple days before the program. You're going to learn a lot. Those of you who have been here before know you learn a lot each time. I frankly learn something every single time, and I do all these training sessions. But you still need to be there at 8. Why? Because you're going to be meeting with a lot of other people who you haven't met before. You're going to figure out what station am I going to be at? What am I going to be doing today? We want to get your coats and gloves and your anything that you brought with you secured so it's away from where everybody else is. And just get yourself oriented. Doors open at 10. They close at 3. Now, who's done it here before in the room has actually left at 3? Doesn't happen. And that's because the doors close at 3, but that means someone's just starting into the process. And so it's usually a couple hours during that time. So somewhere around there, we start seeing things quiet down at some of the locations. But we should say you should expect to stay until at least 5 o'clock. And if people are still through, we start taking volunteers. Can you stay a little bit later? We still have some people to go through. We do have a new process, as Jennifer showed you. There's this chart, and it's color. It's got boxes and squares and little explosions all over the place. But we really need people to understand that there is this process, and we think it's going to be a more efficient way to get people through and get them out efficiently. Some of the changes, though, for those of you who've done this before, there's a trained paralegal who will do the intake to evaluate English proficiency. We've had some issues with people who just clearly were not going to be able to get through the end of the process. And we're going to try to screen them out if that's appropriate so that we're not taking up hours of people's time. The intake process, long as it is, has been shortened. And so that's a process we really are hoping to get working really well this year. And some of the people do come into us with a criminal history. Sometimes those things happen, and people who do have a criminal history have special processes that they need to go through. We need to be sure that actually applying for naturalization is something that will turn out in their favor, that at least should turn out in their favor. But some people, we're going to be telling them, 1, you might not be eligible to apply for naturalization, or 2, if you apply, some really bad things could be happening to you. We want to make sure to protect people from that possibility. All right, so I'm going to move on to slide number 5. Let's see here. The intake form. Excuse me, what to expect. It's important to remember, all clients go through a quality review. And why am I saying this? So, sometimes it seems that in the interest of speeding things up, well, I'll just do this or whatever, or I'll get them over to that attorney. We've really installed some kind of a lockstep processes. Everybody has to go through a flow manager. This is something that we think is going to really help this year. So when someone's done at one station, they go to the flow manager. They don't just get sent to the next table to talk to whoever's there. The flow manager will make sure that people are being handled efficiently. Why is that? Sometimes people get out of synchronization in the flow, and we've actually had some people who've been kind of stuck waiting for a couple hours to get into the next level. So we really want to make sure we're serving people in a really good way. All clients get the client packet from the attorney indicating what to do, what's next. It's an important point. When they walk out of that room, some people say, okay, am I a citizen? They just did this big, long process, and we need them to understand that this is just the beginning of a multi-month process where they are going to need to do some studying. I've got a German client of mine who's been taking the 100 questions, and he's so pleased, but he's really worried. He only gets 99 of them correct right now, and he really wants to make sure he has all of them. So we tell him what to do, what's going to happen next. You're going to get notice from the Immigration Service to come down and provide your fingerprints. Okay? That's not a bad thing. We need you to make sure you watch your mail and open the mail and pay attention to those things. A person might get a pink slip. Now this pink slip says, we don't think you're eligible to file. So we really want to actually close that loop, not just say, okay, go, we're done with you today. But we want to say, we don't think you're eligible. Here's some information for you. Or actually going to have the completed N400 and ready to go, telling them where's the local post office or the FedEx or UPS courier service, so they can drop it off and be on to the next set of the process. Right? I'm going to go on to slide number 5, resources for attorneys. Any attorneys in the room right now? Okay, none in the room right now. If we have you on phone, just so you all know, there's a whole section, I mean several sections, tables of resources that are available to everybody there. Attorney binders for attorneys that have all the legal issues and the laws there, a box with resources and a resource table. We want you to use your time between 8 and 10. And go around and check out what else is around there so that if someone asks you a question, well, do they have this translated into Vietnamese? Oh yeah, we've got a table back there that's got some information for you. I'll make sure that you have it before you leave. That's something for you to be able to check out. Also, if you have a question on the day, there's a site coordinator at every site, not just the flow manager, but a site coordinator's job is to make sure everything's working there. So these people are available as well. I'm going to catch my breath there for a second, and moving on to slide number 7. Emily, you want to start off with what's the next part of it?
Sure. Okay, so I'm Emily Headings. I'm an attorney at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project here in Seattle, and I work primarily on naturalization and citizenship issues. So this is very familiar territory. Now Greg's given us a great overview of the day and the process and kind of what the rooms are going to look like. So now we're going to move on to more of the naturalization information and some of the information you'll be getting from the participants in the day. First, we're going to just briefly go over what are the requirements for naturalization, and they are listed nicely right here. An applicant needs to be at least 18 years old to become a citizen. There are several residency requirements that we'll go into in more detail in just a minute. There's also requirements related to physical presence, being actually inside the United States. We will talk about the good moral character requirement, and this is one of the more complex areas of the naturalization laws. And finally, we'll also talk about the English requirements, which have to do with how much English a person needs to speak, read, and write in order to qualify for citizenship. They also need to have a basic knowledge of U.S. history and civics, and they need to be willing to take an oath of loyalty or an oath of allegiance to the United States. And we'll go into more detail about each of those as we go along here.
All right, next slide, number 8. I wish I could work this out. So, kind of that's a little bit redundant, I think, so I'm going to do it real quick. This continuous residence is a big question. We're going to go over some of the details about what that means. How about if I just run this one and the next one? Continuous residence, physical presence. So I have to show that I was physically in the United States and I can't have left and things like that? No, that's not the case. That's not how it works. Let's move on to actually slide number 8. And we're going to talk about this continuous residence requirements. Well, first of all, here's, for those of you who aren't lawyers, which is everybody in this room, a little lingo here. LPR, lawful permanent resident. When a person says they're a green card holder, we lawyers think they're a lawful permanent resident. And that's what we call them, LPRs. And so a person has to have been a lawful permanent resident to be able to apply for naturalization. And there are 2 different time periods. One is that most of the people you'll be talking to must have been an LPR for 5 years. But certain people, if they're married to U.S. citizens and living in marital union at the time of filing, they can file at 3 years of having been married to the U.S. citizen. So one of the questions right at the very beginning of the N400 form is, which one are you applying for, 5 years or 3 years? And if a person can apply basically, married to a U.S. citizen, they've been living with them for the last 3 years as a husband and wife, that's a good thing to do. We really encourage people to consider using the shorter time period if that's available. There's a couple little tricks in there we want to make sure people deal with, and you're not going to be asked to work through the complicated part of it, but the 5-year, 3-year issue. Residence is another issue. The residence has to be continuous. Now, a lot of people again say, you mean I can't have left? What do you mean by that? Well, absences are allowed, but there are certain periods of time that if you were out that long, it's going to be an issue. We have to start talking and working through that issue. So we'll talk about that in terms of that 5-year period or 3-year period of time. There's a 3-month issue, 3 months residence. When a person files, they're supposed to have been resident in the local district, and here, for those of us here in this room, we're using the Seattle field office as the area. They have to have been resident in that district for 3 months, but there's an exception there. A person has to reside in the United States at the time of filing until through to the oath. So they can't kind of pick up and move out of the country after they file this thing and say, well, I'll come back for the naturalization examination. It doesn't work. But they are allowed to be absent. They can go on vacations and holidays and things like that, but just they can't leave the United States as their permanent residence. And, as I said, this 3-month issue at the bottom bullet point may apply 3 months before they've hit that resident in the district thing. So I think that's just kind of a bizarre little rule. You have to apply 3 months in advance. I mean, you have to have been resident in the district for 3 months, but you can apply 3 months early. Well, the way I look at that rule is the government's it used to take a long, long time. And so the government said, you file it. By the time those 3 months have come and gone, you'll have been resident in the district, and we're going to get your application 4 months, 8 months, whatever. About 1.5 years ago, they started getting really fast, and they started realizing, whoa, we're interviewing people too early now. So generally, Emily, I don't know about your view, but my view is if a person has just really moved into the Seattle area and they're planning to live here now for the next couple of years, whatever, it's going to be okay for that person to file generally.
I would say so, and unless they just moved here, and where I might say, maybe wait till April, because I have had applicants whose process has been less than 3 months, and I can see that, they might get dinged for that if they get to their interview and they haven't actually lived in the Seattle field district for 3 months.
And that is exactly what happened a couple of years ago. The head guy of the INS came out here and said, we got a little ahead of ourselves. We were scheduling some interviews 2.5 months after the filing, and we suddenly realized, we told the people, don't come in for your interview. We'd have to deny you. So yeah, if someone's just moved in, probably a good idea to say, hold on to it and wait to file. Emily, I moved it to the next one on physical presence.
Okay, sure. So the second requirement is the physical presence requirement, and it's distinct from the continuous residence requirement that Greg was just talking about. The residence is where you live, where you have your home. Physical presence is just being physically inside the boundaries of the United States. And so for that 5 or 3 year period that you're to show continuous residence, you also have to show that you were physically present inside the United States for half of that time. And so this works out to be for someone who's applying under the five years of continuous residence, that's 912 and a half days. So if you get down to counting days with someone who's had multiple trips or comes in with a passport with lots of stamps going in and out, you might end up actually counting days to make sure that they were in the United States for what works out to be 2.5 years of the past 5 years. And then same rule for people who are applying under the 3 year rule, they have to be physically present in the United States for half that time, which works out to be 547 and a half days. So it's kind of rare that you encounter that, but you might find some applicants who have lots of trips. Yes.
I had a client for a citizenship application who was actually, she had moved back to Thailand but still had her green card. And so at the 5 year mark, she was still in Thailand but had moved back to the United States. Is it okay if the 5 year mark is while they were in another country?
Can you repeat that?
Okay, so the question from here in the room was that if someone is overseas, traveling overseas when they hit the 5 year mark, are they still eligible to apply for naturalization? So then the question is, you have to look at the 2 requirements that we just talked about. Were they actually living in the United States for 5 years before applying. And it's okay if they're traveling, to see family or vacation or whatever in a different country when the 5-year mark hits. But they do need to show that they were residing here, this was their home. And then they also have to show that they were physically here for 2.5 years during the last 5 years. Does that answer your question?
Sort of, but I think that's a specific question that really won't, we won't be running into a lot during the.
Well, so, the point is, if the person is actually living here and is vacationing or just traveling outside when 5 years hits, practically they'll be here when they're submitting the application, most likely.
Right.
But, they do need to be showing that they're living here. You kind of said she had moved to Thailand.
Right, yeah.
That would
like
sort of
an
indicate
address
to me
change,
she doesn't live here.
Right.
But, I don't know, do you have anything else to add, Greg,
No,
to that?
and I think what I tell people, sometimes when people are kind of anxious saying, well, I do want to move out of the United States, my reminder is, this is a filing as a permanent resident where your primary residence is the United States. As soon as you become a citizen, if you meet the standards, you can live anywhere you want to the world, but it's time to take account of what your plans are, because this is part of the application.
Yeah. So, okay, and just to note that, immigration does tally it all up. If you have someone with lots of trips, they will tell you, or tell them when they go into their interview, oh, I noticed you were out for 954 days, So they will also have a tally of that. So, just be really careful with the details on that.
All right, we're going to go on to the next, and I've actually had them, pull out your passport. We're going to go through it page by page, and we're going to look at these days. We're going to add everything up, and then questions like, well, why did you take that trip? Because the officer's trying to investigate. Do you really think you live in the United States anymore? So it is an important issue.
One thing I just thought of to mention for back to the continuous residence requirement. If you see someone with an absence of a year or more, that automatically breaks the continuous residence, and they have to start building it up again. So if you see that, that's a big red flag if it happened within the last 5 years, and you should flag it for the attorneys who are going to review it.
And that's that issue of the continuous residence that I was talking about. It's 5 years continuous residence during that period of time, and if you have that break, there's an issue about permanent residence status potentially as well, but it certainly means that significant enough break, you start the 5-year period over again. So a lot of people actually plan their travel to make sure they don't have that kind of problem, because they want to get their 5 years as quickly as possible.
For 6 months to a year, what kind of documentation do you need to provide?
And the question was 6 months to a year, what kind of documentation to provide? And we'll be talking about this in a couple more minutes, but no, that's all right. So basically, like I said, travel. Okay, I think I get like 3 weeks of vacation, 4 weeks of vacation a year. People say, is that okay? I can be gone out of the United States? Sure, no problem. The government rule is basically anything for 6 months or less is okay. Now, they might still ask questions about it, but 6 months or less, you're a returning resident, you're able to go with that. More than 6 months to a year, the government's going to have some serious questions for you. They're going to be asking, why did you intend to return when you left? Did you already have a plan to come back? Did you have a return trip ticket? Where do you live? Where do you pay your taxes? But you can overcome that. But at 1 year or more, the government enters a kind of a presumption about that break.
It's automatic.
Yeah. So, things you have to prove. All right, we're going to talk about good moral character. First of all, I'm going to tell you, this particular slide covers way more information than you're going to need to know as non-paralegals, all right? So I'm going to do it really quickly. You do not need to memorize slide number 11. This is really important for people as we're going, for paralegals and the attorneys especially, as we're going through issues. Is this person someone who should not be applying for naturalization? And there are certain mandatory prohibitions against getting citizenship, certain kinds of things. Conviction of an aggravated felony after that particular date in 1990. An aggravated felony does not mean what you and I think of as aggravated felony. It's a special word for immigration. Even criminal defense lawyers, it means something different than what they're used to dealing with.
Should it be that date in 1991 since it's past?
Could Could it mean the date in 1991?
Past 20 years, or is it?
Oh,
No, it is that date. That's when a particular law went into effect.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah, that date is that's what it is always.
the date November 29th, 1990 is a date in which the law got changed, much to the of everybody who deals with immigration. But that's when they changed the rules, and they said, now it's a big issue. And then there are certain things that if they occurred within the 3 or 5 year window, you just can't apply. It's just not going to work. And these are conviction or admission of a CIMT, crime involving moral turpitude, which, if you can define that, you can come up here and start talking to everybody else, right? It's a complicated issue. I always have to look for the definition of it when I get into it. But let's talk about some other things. Certain kinds of 2 or more offenses where there's an aggregate sentence of more than 5 years, convictions where there's certain jail time, false testimony to get an immigration benefit, alien smuggling, which can be, driving through the border with a Canadian friend of yours in the car that you said, oh yeah, we're all U.S. citizens. Well, maybe is that alien smuggling? Polygamy, I haven't had one of those yet, although those of us who are immigration lawyers have seen clients who think they're married to their current spouse, but who actually didn't get divorced from their prior spouse, and so there's issues there. Habitual drunkard, which is an interesting one, gambling, things like that. So these are things that we talk about, people, and they are serious questions that are part of the immigration form, and we'll decide if those are issues that occurred within the 3 or 5 years. No, you're not going to be able to apply. It doesn't prevent you from becoming a citizen later on, but we have to let that window go into the past, and then we'll be able to apply later on.
Okay, so Greg was just talking about, next slide, Greg was just talking about the things that that prevent you from applying if they happen within the last 3 to 5 years. The next types of conduct I'm going to talk about are not mandatory bars, but there's something that immigration might consider in determining if the applicant met the good moral character requirement. And so these are things that it's possible to overcome and provide evidence or explain your circumstances enough that you can still show you're eligible for citizenship. And these include things like not paying child support, not supporting your kids, things like registering to vote or voting before you become a U.S. citizen, which isn't allowed, not paying your taxes or owing taxes to the government. If you're a male, not registering for selective service when you were supposed to register. Or then there's this kind of catch-all category, other unlawful acts. Immigration can kind of look at anything in your record the last 5 years and determine if that shows that you're not quite meeting the standard of an average citizen in the community and therefore not a person of good moral character. We also have down there extramarital affair. I've never seen an example of this being something that prevents someone from showing good moral character, but it is still in the regulations. So that may come up in an applicant.
Emily, I actually had one case where I had a client who was going through the process, who there was an allegation raised to the Immigration Service. This guy has had an affair with my wife. And it ultimately did not become an issue in the naturalization, but I could see how it could happen.
Yeah, and in the case Greg mentioned, maybe the person provided an explanation or gave the context, and that allowed him to overcome that. But and the same for any of these. One of the immigration lawyers at Naturalization Day may talk to the person and say, hey, you could still naturalize, but be sure you take your tax returns or your tax payment plan to the interview so that you can show you're still a person of good moral character. So, any questions about this? Yes.
The question about have you been deemed legally incompetent or confined to a mental institution within the past 5 years?
Mm-hmm.
Where does that fall in? I mean, I realize that's not a moral character issue.
Yeah. So the question, someone was asking about the question on the form that had to do with if a person's been confined to a mental institution, and we'll actually get more specific to questions on the N400 in just a minute. But the general answer to that is that's not a good moral character issue. It's more of if the person is able to make take an oath competently. So that's kind of a different issue than good moral character. So, any other questions about this good moral character requirement before we move on? Dance.
Those of you who aren't in the room don't get to see Emily and I jostling for position here. We're deciding it's going to keep you folks active and watching all the time. The English language ability, this is slide number 13. And you just get a couple of things here. Sometimes when you are talking with people, like I said, first of all, we've instituted a new part of the process. We're going to be doing a bit of screening in advance before a person even gets into the system to try to do a little bit of a decision making as to whether there's going to be that ability to meet it. But sometimes during the course of it, people say, and I'll have clients of mine say to me, oh, Mr. Rogers, and the first thing I say is, don't call me Mr. Rogers. It's a different neighborhood. But, Mr. Rogers, I'm sorry, but my English is not so good. And my immediate response is, you speak 2 languages, I speak 1. Your English is fine. But if a person can say that kind of thing, they're probably doing pretty well. But the real issue is that they're going to be tested on their English language ability at the time of the interview. There are some of the things that are important at the time of the filing, but the English language ability is at the time of the interview. And that will probably be an average of 4 months, 3 to 4 months from the date that they do the filing. So they do have a chance to get ready. And they say, well, what am I going to be tested on? Remember I told you about the resource tables that that are in the room? You're going to be able to see the kinds of things they're tested on pretty much. Basically, it's to be able to read or write 1 or 2 basic English sentences and really basic sentences. The officer might say, what is the Congress of the United States? Okay, could you write that? Or some basic thing like that. So it's just the words. It's not a spelling test, okay, but it's the ability to read and write English. About 4th grade level is what we say in terms of the ability here. There are some exemptions though, and some people say, oh, I just don't know if I'm going to be able to do this, or maybe through their interpreter they say that. So here's a couple things on the exemptions. If a person is over 50 years old and has been a permanent resident for at least 20 years, they've been here for a pretty long time, they can be exempted from the English language ability test. They're still going to be required to take the history and civics test, but it will be in the language of their choice. But they'll still be tested on that. If the person is over 55 and they've been a permanent resident at least 15 years, so a little bit older but a little less time as a permanent resident, they can be exempted from the English test, but they'll still be tested on the history and civics in the language of their choice. And if they're over 65 and have been a permanent resident at least 20 years, they're exempted from the English. And the history and civics language test is in the language of their choice, and they have fewer questions that they have to study from. There's a list of 100 questions that are there for everybody to see with the basic answers already provided. Well, they might say, wow, that's just too daunting for me to do. Their group is limited, and they know which 20 they're going to be asked to look at. So it's a pretty nice process that gives people a sense of comfort there. There also is a disability waiver. Some people say, I'm not going to be able to speak English, and it's not because I fit these age issues or anything else. I have a disability. The important thing for people to remember here is disability is this is not for people like you or me to judge. This is something that a professional has to assist with, and we have a form that we're going to be providing to people there to do it. Let's see. Right, okay, here we go.
And just a quick note on those exemptions that Greg was just talking about. They have to be eligible for those at the time they apply. If they're turning 50 next month and they want to use that exemption, they shouldn't send their application in until they've actually turned 50 or 55 or 65. So if you run across that, make sure you point that out to them. Yes, Lee?
If they're illiterate, does that fall under the category of disability, or is there any kind of provision for that?
Not necessarily. Oh, sorry. The question was, if the person's illiterate, will they qualify for the disability waiver or the exemptions, I guess? Well, the exemptions are based on length of residency and age. The disability waiver, so illiteracy alone or old age even alone does not qualify someone for the disability waiver. It's supposed to be a medical condition that's been diagnosed by a doctor or a clinical psychologist or a doctor of osteopathy. And so one of those medical professionals would need to complete the form and say, this person has this disability that prevents them from learning. And so someone may be illiterate and they may be elderly, but they may also have dementia or have had a stroke or various other conditions that prevent them from being able to learn or show that they have knowledge of English and U.S. history. So, I mean, if someone comes in and says they're illiterate, you could ask a little bit more and say, oh, do you see your doctor for anything? Oh, maybe you should take them this form, which is the N648 form, and see if your doctor is willing to fill that out. So, okay, so now let's go on to slide number 14, which is the U.S. history and civics requirement. And so this is separate from the English requirement. It's knowing a little bit about history and civics of the United States. I believe at every site there'll be the list of 100 questions. And also it's possible to download the history questions from the USCIS website. In addition, when someone goes in for their fingerprints, halfway through the process, they'll be given a booklet like the one that someone in this room was holding up. Those are the flashcards actually. But they'll also be given a booklet that has all the questions and even additional information about U.S. history for them to learn. So during the citizenship interview, they'll have 10 random questions that will be generated by the adjudicator, and they have to answer 6 of them correctly in order to pass the test. So if they get 6 right, the officer just stops there. They don't go on to ask them 10 questions even. Then as Greg mentioned, even if they have the English exemption, they still have to, they still have to answer the history questions in their own language, and there are translations of the questions that will be available for people who speak other languages and qualify for an exemption. And just to note that the disability waiver we had talked about can be a waiver of the English requirement or the history requirement or both. All right, so let's go on to the next slide.
Emily said something that reminded me of another important thing in this, and the intake form, which is slide number 15, is a helpful place to discuss this. For those of you who haven't done this before, this is going to be like for a person going to a doctor's office. A person's going to walk in, going to meet someone that they have never met in the world and will never see again, and they're going to disclose information that they might never tell anybody else in the world. And so one thing that's really, really critical for us all to understand is we have to treat people with care, and we have to be professional, even though we're volunteers, and make sure people understand that we're taking information with absolute confidentiality. Sometimes you're going to be in a situation where you're going to have to ask questions about criminal history or whether a person's seeing a doctor or things like that. And what you need to do is think about the surroundings you're in and who you're talking with. Sometimes people go in there with I've got my wife and my kids and I'm going in, this is a really important thing, and then you say, do you have any children born outside marriage? Well, this is part of, you're dealing with this question, I just need to know. The person's like, if I thought you were gonna ask that question, I would have had my wife and kids step away for a little bit. Because it's also important that person be honest in what they do. And you don't want to put them in a position where what you ask them causes them to feel that they might need to lie or not tell the truth because of the people around them. So think about those kind of things as you're going through this. Let's look at this client intake form though. One thing we want people to understand is that we're here to help them today. We're not here to provide service to them on an ongoing basis. You're only doing one day in the presentation beforehand, and we're making sure people understand that. This is a one-day thing. These are people who are volunteering their services. We're not going to keep working with them as we go forward. They have some other services that will be available to them. We're letting them know in the second bullet point, I have to be completely truthful. Again, criminal history, children born outside marriage, tax fraud, all sort of payment of child, what is it?
Child support.
Child support, thank you, I couldn't think of the term. These things, they have to report these things. the US government is going to be taking their fingerprints and running it through an FBI check. They're going to find out information. So to lie on a form just adds to the problems that they've got. And we're also letting them know that we do treat this information confidentiality. The Washington New Americans program is going to be contacting some of the people for follow-up and things like that, but still the information is really, really treated confidentially. So we need to do that.
All right, so let's move on to slide 16, which just is some pointers about working with an interpreter. Now, some of you may be serving as interpreters for Citizenship Day, and some of you may be doing intake or filling out forms where you're using the assistance of an interpreter to get the information. And so these are just a couple of quick pointers on how to make that most effective. First of all, when you're meeting the interpreter, be sure to explain the procedures to them and let them know that all this information is to be kept confidential. And you can also, of course, assure the applicant that the interpreter will keep information confidential. As an interpreter, you want to do word-for-word translation as much as possible, which means that if you're the person asking questions, you need to keep your questions fairly concise. And if the applicant is talking for quite a while, you can have them pause so that the interpreter has a chance to interpret accurately. Let's see. Also keep in mind that interpreting is hard work. It's very draining to be an interpreter, and so if the interpreter needs a break, every 15 minutes, every half hour, keep that in mind and keep checking in with the person who's interpreting for you, so that you can keep getting accurate information, which is so important. Anything Jennifer or Greg want to add about, or anyone who's been working as an interpreter want to add about what's key?
From my standpoint, we got a comment here, yeah.
I just have one comment to make, and that is you need to distinguish carefully between interpreting and translating. Because interpreting is not necessarily word for word.
Okay, and someone here made a comment about the distinction between interpreting and translating, and that interpreting is not necessarily word for word. Is that right? Okay. My understanding was translating is a written document versus oral is interpreting. Is that how you understand it?
I believe actually that translating is literally translating word for word, and interpreting is sort of giving the gist of what is being said.
And I'll just follow through. Translating is word for word versus interpreting is the gist. And I think that's a good way of that I think of it as well. And the way I look at it is this. And I actually, because of the pressure on us during this day, I hope it's a little bit of a kindness to our interpreters. Sorry, you don't exist. You're just this box where my words go in one ear and the words in the other language come out. So when I say, well, tell me, Emily, are you wearing a sweater today? The interpreter does not say, he wanted to know what color sweater you're wearing. It's not he says, well, tell me, Emily, what color sweater. And so it's not a he said, she said, or anything like that, because that can serve to put it into the box that it should be. And it can also be used by the interpreter as an opportunity when someone says, what does she mean by that? I'm not quite sure what she's saying. The interpreter doesn't, well, I think she means that. You don't have to have those conversations. And generally as attorneys, when we see that going, we say, whoa. I didn't have a break like that. I just need you ask her question to me or me to her, and that's where we go. But I agree. I think it's a good way to focus on the words, not an interpretation, especially as we get to the lawyers' tables. We're getting more complicated issues, and we really can't let someone's, especially who we have never worked with. It goes from me, it's like that can game, or the whispering game where you whisper from one person to another. By the time it gets to the end, it's something completely different. So we really try to do that word for word. I think is a good way to look at it.
Hello, may I make one comment about interpreting too?
Please do.
I'm a paralegal and an interpreter, and if the legal staff work through the interpreter, ask the client, and commit to the clients to use as few idiomatic expressions as possible. So if you say it was raining cats and dogs, then you interpret that and say it was raining really hard, and the person says, no, what did he say about cats and dogs? So little things like that, especially people who can be intimidated by attorneys will maybe speak indirectly, and so if you can just ask, use your interpreter to ask and commit to speaking directly and plainly with the person, really can save a lot of time.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that
Good
comment.
way to look at it. Well, I just want to let you know it's almost 1:30 because we got to start a little bit late, but we're at the point where if you're not a paralegal, you really don't need to be here for the rest of this because we're going to go into some of the details of the form. I have a comment back there? Yes?
When I was in Yakima, I started out in the intake area, and then they said, would you please become a paralegal? So, I mean, a whole lot of us who were not paralegals became paralegals,
So
Can I
congratulations.
answer that question?
Please stay.
So in Yakima was a unique situation
Was it? Okay.
because we were very desperate for paralegals,
Okay.
and so normally we would not request that of
good.
people.
Alright.
It's just because of volunteer shortages, and I'm sure you know how late that site was open. So
Yeah. And it happened like, here, stop doing that, start doing this, and so.
Yeah,
I
that's
feel like I
not
need to
a
know
normal
this just in
situation.
case it happens again, so.
So the comment we got was, I was at a program last year where they just kind of recruited me to be a paralegal right during the course of it, and had you gone to the sessions?
I've been here, yeah.
You had, she had
And
been
then I got
involved with
another
them,
refresher
so she
course
had
from
it
the
all.
main lawyer right
Which
there,
just
but I
is
went
the
right into it.
rolling it into, you're welcome to stay. I won't get offended if any of you leave, because if you're not paralegals, that's it. But we're gonna talk about the details of the form, and we'll go as quickly as possible to try to get that done. I'd like to ask, on the phone, do we have paralegals who are on the phone with us?
Yeah.
Okay, we have at least a few. So let me just start into,
Yes.
okay.
No.
Okay,
May I ask a question?
yes, please?
So in the past, there were non-paralegals filling out N-400 forms, but I'm not a paralegal. So I would just be doing general volunteer things?
Yes, Jennifer says yes.
law students,
Law
Okay.
students,
paralegal students.
paralegal students.
Can be paralegals. I know in
Those people
Vancouver
can be
we
paralegals.
have a severe need for paralegals. So if we feel like someone is trainable, or if they have experience completing other forms, this is the one site where we're making that exception, but it's not something we normally do.
So the Vancouver site, any of you who are going there, if you're thinking you might, so it sounds like you got to hear that, then good. So we might revert you if we need to, and we'd probably like to hear from you about that. So let's go into the N-400 form. Here's the form, this is what it looks like, double-sided. Some of you on the phone don't have it, well, and you don't necessarily have to have it with you. But what's the thing that we really got here? We want a complete and accurate N-400. That's the critical issue here when people do this.